And welcome. I'm Dr. Kim Hunter-Reid, Commissioner of Higher Education for the state of Louisiana. We are with the Climate Action Initiative, and we are very excited to be working in higher education on the Climate Action Initiative, working to develop an action plan so that the higher ed sector is moving toward climate action in a very meaningful and impactful way. Before we get started, I want to thank our wonderful panelists for joining us today, and all of you for joining us as well. But we have a special guest with us, the president of the Aspen Institute, Dan Porterfield, and I'd like to turn it over to him to say a few words. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you, Commissioner Reid. I'm so glad to be here today for the last listening session of the Higher Ed Climate Action Task Force. And a big thanks also, Kim, to your co-chair, Dr. Mildred García, the Chancellor of the Cal State University system. That's a big system. And all of the task force members for the time and energy that each of you has put into this really important galvanizing initiative. I also want to give a huge shout out to our energy and environment team at the Aspen Institute, led by Greg Gershuni and Maria Ortiz Perez. Laura Shifter does extraordinary work in pulling people together in the education sector to share promising practices, perspectives, experiences, solutions, hopes, dreams, big questions, to mobilize groups for collective impact that then not only makes a difference substantively, but also reinforces that critical message that everyone can make a difference, all of us can, and that all of us can try. We gain so much moral support and energy and for change when we see others also, like Dr. King said, putting their hearts and minds in motion for change. And one of the things about the climate crisis is it really does require everyone, every person, every community, every institution. We all can do something. And all too often, the forces of pessimism or cynicism or division make us feel as if there's nothing we can do, when in fact the exact opposite is the case in this case. So I'm really proud to be an honorary member of the task force, and I was a college president before coming to the Aspen Institute, so I certainly know what a critical role higher education institutions and systems, and then the sectors, play in advancing climate solutions all across society, building a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable world, and making a difference in community, in the places where institutions are, anchors for the community, and creating jobs and creating discovery and creating civil dialogue and learning opportunity for young people, and have all of that connected to climate solutions is so powerful, such a testimony to the importance of higher ed today, no matter what we may hear from some voices on the outliers who are trying to point to college as a collection of problems. We know that college higher education is a collection of assets, and mobilizing those assets makes a difference for today and tomorrow, for both the now, if you will, and the next. And the Aspen Institute, our purpose is to ignite human potential, to help others and work with others to build understanding and create new possibilities for a better world. And this task force is working to do just that. And we thank you so much. It's a big priority of the Institute to help bring people together for climate solutions, climate learning, climate optimism, and climate determination. And you are leading that, and we thank you so, so much. We're quite lucky today to be joined by this panel, which includes the former minority leader of the Georgia House of Representatives, Stacey Abrams, a leader, a hero, an Aspen Fellow. Thank you so much, Stacey, for joining, along with Anthony Lazarowitz of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, and big learning has come out of that program, and Saori Perez with the Clio Institute, which I've had a chance to see firsthand, building real understanding among younger people towards solutions. And I just love the way that you together as a group can leverage policy, communications, organizing, learning, higher education, research, and teamwork to advance this work at scale. I look forward to seeing the impact and influence of the task force's work and doing my part to support your work. Thank you so much. And back to you, Kim.
Oh, thank you so much, Dan. We appreciate it. And Your leadership has been phenomenal, and you're right about the now and the next. And we're excited to jump into that and have this fantastic conversation. We have been learning from many stakeholders, and this is our sixth and final listening session. So we've been taking it all in. But I do have another welcome to say, and that's my co-moderator for today's listening session, and that's Catherine Wilkinson. So Catherine, thank you for joining as well.
Thank you so much, Kim, and it's great to see all of you. I am Catherine Wilkinson. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the All We Can Save Project, which is a climate engagement and education nonprofit, also a member of this wonderful task force. And I spend my days in the climate community. So part of my role on the task force is to help bridge between that world and the world of higher ed, which is also a space I love very much and know well. And we do have a fantastic panel today to help us examine the critical roles of public policy, of organizing, and of climate messaging as we look to scale up climate action within higher education. And Kim, I don't think we should waste any more time. We should jump into this rich dialogue. So I'll hand it back over to you.
Indeed, let's jump in as you have said. So we'll get started. We'll hear from each of the panelists first, and then task force members, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of this very rich and well-informed group of panelists that we have with us today. So we will begin with Anthony Leiserowitz from the Yale program of Climate Change Communication. Anthony, thank you so much for being with us.
All right, thank you so much. Let me just make sure the tech works. Can I get a thumbs up that you can see that?
We can see you.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to join you for this really important conversation. Greetings from Dubai, so happy afternoon to all of you. It's pretty late here. Very quickly, my name is Anthony Leiserowitz. I'm a faculty member at the Yale School of the Environment, where I direct the Yale program on climate change communication. We study how Americans and other people around the world respond to the issue of climate change. So what do they understand and misunderstand about the causes, the consequences, and solutions, how they perceive the risks, what kinds of policies they support or oppose, and then what kinds of behaviors are people engaged in or willing to change in order to maintain a safe and stable climate. And then ultimately, as scientists, our question is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, and political reasons why some people get very engaged with this issue, others are kind of apathetic, and some are downright dismissive and hostile, or at least they are here in the United States. So I'm going to share with you just a few pieces from a very long series of studies that we've been doing here in the United States that we call Climate Change in the American Mind. This is done in partnership with our colleagues down at George Mason University. There we go. So first of all, let's just start with some fundamentals of climate literacy. And that is, do Americans understand that global warming is happening, that it's real? And what you can see here is all of the nationally representative surveys that we've been conducting for the past 15 years, every spring, every fall, every spring, every fall. Starting back here in 2008, when Americans were at a kind of a high water mark, we saw then a huge 14 percentage point drop, bottoming out in 2010. Since then, it's been slowly working its way back up until here we are just last spring. We'll have new data coming out in the next few weeks, but this is from last spring, where we are at 74% of Americans understand that global warming is happening. This is near an all-time high. Yay, America, good job. But just to put that into context, if we were in Brazil or in Japan, that number would be over 95%. So we do still have a substantial proportion of the population that either doesn't think it's happening at all or says that they don't know. This is also a problem when it comes to, do they understand that it's mostly human caused? In fact, it's entirely human caused. Here, as of our most recent study in the spring of this year, 61% of Americans understood that it is mostly human caused, but you've still got about 28% of Americans who think it's natural. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding, because if you don't understand that it's the burning of fossil fuels and land use change that is causing this problem, then many people just think, hey, it's natural cycles. It gets hot, it gets cold, it gets wet, it gets dry. We can hunker down and deal with it, but we can't control it. So this is still a fundamental thing that we have to be able to educate everyone about. And of course, higher education is going to play a crucial role in that larger societal process. And then we also track, and this stands in for a whole bunch of risk perception items of how worried are people about this issue. And yes, it has been growing over the past few years, but still only about 30% 30% of Americans say that they're very worried about this issue. And one of the main reasons is that for many people, climate change is still viewed as a distant problem, distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. They think this is about polar bears or maybe developing countries, but not the United States, not my community, not my friends, not my family, not me. And as a result, it's psychologically distant. It just becomes one of 100 other issues that's out there. And maybe I kind of support action, but I don't yet understand why this is so important. I don't yet understand why this is so urgent. So we still need to help people understand that climate change is not far away in time and space. It's happening right here, right now, and Americans are being harmed every single day all across the country. And in fact, of course, it's a global problem. So people are suffering these consequences everywhere. Another crucial thing that we've learned in our research is that, of course, one of the first rules of effective communication is know your audience. Who are they? What do they know? Who do they trust? How do you best engage them in their learning journey? Not our learning journey, but their learning journey. And 15 years ago, we identified what we call global warming's 6 Americas, and they're arranged on this spectrum. And let me just quickly introduce you to your fellow Americans. 26% are alarmed about climate change. They're fully convinced it's happening, human cause, serious and urgent. They strongly support action, but the giant question in their mind is, what do we do? What can I do as an individual? What can we do as a community? What can we do as a city, a state, the nation, and yes, the world? So we've actually done a decent job of communicating the scope of the problem to them, but they don't yet know what the solutions are. So that is really the key thing they're looking for. Then we see a group called the concerned, who also think it's happening in human cause and serious, but again, they still think of it as distant in time and space, so they don't really prioritize it. Then a cautious, who are still confused and on the fence. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? They're paying attention, but just haven't really made up their minds. Then I think a small but very important group that we call the disengaged. And these are people who, believe it or not, basically say, I've never heard of that term global warming before. I don't know anything about the causes, the consequences, or solutions. So it's basic awareness that they really are still struggling with. Then comes a group we call the doubtful. And these are people who say, I don't think it's real, but if it is, it's just natural cycles. Nothing we had anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about. And then last but not least is a group we call the dismissive, who are firmly convinced it's not happening, human caused or serious, and most of whom quite literally tell us that they're conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away our sovereignty, it's a get-rich scheme by Al Gore and his friends, any other such conspiracy type narratives. Now, critically, I just want to underscore, they're only 11%. They're only 11%. But they're a really loud 11%, and they've tended to dominate the public square to such an extent, and we see this across the board, from politicians to journalists to educators in universities all over the country, who are now afraid to bring up climate change because they're afraid they're going to be attacked, because they believe that's half or more of the country. It's not. They're just loud. Okay? So I really just want to say that for many people, this small group is really kind of constraining and causing what we call climate silence. Then we've been tracking these over time, and so this is just the point that we've seen tremendous change. So 10 years ago, in 2012, there was 1 alarmed for every 1 dismissive, essentially, in this country. But in the intervening 10 years, the alarmed have more than doubled in size, where there's now 2.5 alarmed for every 1 dismissive in the country. And that reflects a fundamental shift in the underlying social, cultural, and political climate of climate change. It helps us understand how major climate legislation has now been passed at cities, by states, and by the federal government that is historic, groundbreaking, some of the biggest policy wins in human history, although it's still not enough, and it still needs to go farther and faster. So it's just to say that those underlying cultural and political conditions have shifted enough to make climate policy much, much more possible than it was in the past. And then the last thing I want to point to is actually an online interactive tool that we call the Yale Climate Opinion Maps, where we've taken this data and made it available for all 50 states, all 435 congressional districts, the 1,000 largest cities, and all the way down to 3,000 plus counties across the country. And what you're looking at is one of our policy items. So you can visit this site, drill down to whatever location you're interested in. And here I'm taking the question, do you believe that schools should teach about the causes, consequences, and solutions to global warming? And what's so fascinating here is that you see the darker red is where a larger and larger majority of people in that particular county support this climate education. And in every single county in America, you have a substantial majority of Americans who support climate being taught by our schools. That's true in Texas, it's true in Oklahoma, it's true in Wyoming and North Dakota and West Virginia and Alaska, all of our big, large fossil fuel patches. People everywhere think this is an important thing that we should be doing for our kids. So just to quickly sum up, many Americans, including youth that are going through high school and college today, do not yet understand that human-caused climate change is happening or why it is so urgent to act. There are these 6 different audiences, including on every single campus in the country, that are at different stages in their learning journeys. And our job as educators and communicators is to meet them where they are and help them take the next step in their learning journey. And then third, and very importantly for this conversation, Americans overwhelmingly support the teaching of climate change in our schools. And if you'd like to learn any more about everything we do, it's all available on reports on our website. And so I'd encourage you to come visit. Thank you very much.
Excellent information. Thank you very much. I really do appreciate that. I took some good notes. I know the task force members are taking good notes as well, and we'll be adding their questions to the chat. One of the things that I have really enjoyed through all of our listening sessions is not only the expertise that we bring from across the country, but the fact that we have prioritized the student voice in all of our conversations and on our task force as well. And so we're very happy to have Sarai Perez with us, who's a student and a campus climate organizer at the Clio Institute. So I'll turn it over to her. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim, and it's honestly a pleasure to be here today. So again, my name is Sarai Perez, and just to give you a background as to who I am a junior at Florida International University studying international business. Aside from that, I currently hold the Regional Youth Lead Organizer position within the Clio Institute, and we are a 501c3 statewide nonprofit organization, and we dedicate ourselves exclusively to climate change education and advocacy, because that's where we believe a lot of change can be made. As I believe a lot of us on this call also agree, education is where change can be made, right? So another one of my positions that I also just recently was able to hold, I just got voted in as the first youth board member for the Climate Resilience Committee for the City of Miami. And within that position, I'm able to draft legislation and recommend legislation to the City Commission to improve climate resiliency within the city. So beyond that, my presentation today is going to mostly center around my story, in which I hope the task force is able to gain knowledgeable advice from. So I started off in a very small K-12 school. My class was around 30 students. So as you can imagine, climate change education wasn't very discussed upon in my school. It was mostly a very intangible object that was going to be faced in the far future. So it was never going to be my concern. Afterwards, I did graduate. It was after the pandemic, so I went straight into college. It was Miami-Dade College, and it was just like a world opened up before me. It was kind of overwhelming, but it was a very nice change of pace, I would say. So me, along with a friend in our first semester, we started the first Pride Club at our campus. And at first, we just wanted to create a safe space at Miami-Dade College, especially on that campus. But afterwards, we came to realize that we want South Florida to be that safe space. We want Florida, our state, to be that safe space. And afterwards, we started volunteering and doing a lot of voter engagement with fellow grassroots organizations and nonprofit organizations within the area. Afterwards, we realized that the community itself is impacted so intersectionally by so many different issues that we decided to partner with other organizations. So another one was Planned Parenthood for reproductive justice. And then soon after, it was the Clio Institute, in which we became a Gen Clio chapter for climate advocacy as well. So for that journey and how I got involved in that, I started off as an intern for a organization here called Alipata Collaborative CDC, and they focus a lot on low-income housing advocacy and anti-gentrification work. In Miami, that is one of the biggest issues that I've seen facing. It's the lack of affordable housing, lack of, culture being, I guess, instituted and stayed. And I figured that was one of the biggest issues for me, especially in my neighborhood. I saw neighbors getting displaced and I had no idea where they were going to go. I saw my rent prices increasing and all I could really do was just focus on surviving in the now instead of thriving. So I started with that work as an intern with them, and I worked on an episode for a podcast, and it's centered around carbon gentrification. So that's where I started my intersectionality within what I was currently focusing on, and climate. So for those that don't know, carbon gentrification is kind of like a phenomenon in which industries and very affluent, I guess, organizations have increasing carbon emissions under their current sustainability movements or sustainability attempts of improvement. So I made a podcast episode with that with a couple friends at my campus. And then afterwards, I got connected with the Clio Institute. And through them, I attended my first public comment hearing at City Commission, and it was to advocate for the addition of 2 youth seats to the Climate Resilience Committee, which is funny because it came full circle because a year later, I have one of the seats. So I think that's a really good real life example on how just organizing and advocating for something, you can create those opportunities even if they didn't exist previously. So that's one of the examples. Afterwards, I became a campus organizer within their first year of starting the campus organizer program. Clio Institute, they focus a lot on education and advocacy within that, especially within the youth. But the campus organizer positions were kind of the next step on ensuring we had a tangible project in which we can encourage that next generation of youth leaders, right? So I started off in Miami-Dade College. The first semester was just creating that climate presence, that climate awareness within not only the students there, but also the administration. I noticed a very big gap between administration and the student body in which what they were working on sustainability, there was no intercommunication. So that was one of my priorities. For the next semester, I drafted a campaign plan in which Miami-Dade College could commit itself to, written down, and I decided to start meeting with the, I guess, targets that could make sure that this plan could come into action. So I started meeting with the dean of faculty, dean of students, head of facilities, ensuring that we can work together on making sure this plan can come into fruition. I noticed that just students just advocating on our own and administration working on their own projects, we were never really going to get anywhere. It had to be us together working towards something together. So I started with that. And then afterwards, I did graduate. But within the campus organizer positions, there is a contingency plan after. So there are organizers following suit after me, and a group of interns were added afterwards too. So Gen Clio just continues, especially within the queer club that we had. It's Queer Collective. And that intersectional advocacy organization just came into fruition. And now we have hundreds of students that were able to join it and just have that safe space, right? So that's how I got started within Clio. Afterwards, I was promoted into the position that I'm in now. So I'm more of a regional lead and I manage Miami, as well as any public policy, voter engagement, or just education projects that we take into place. And through it, I've been able to not only take what I learned, especially being hands-on, but I was also able to implement it, especially for organizers that I was managing and interns that I was managing. The biggest thing that I've noticed, especially not only from my story, it's the fear that a lot of youth hold. They're very intimidated to get into the climate field. Even before, I was more comfortable staying within the anti-gentrification and low-income housing sector instead of going into climate because I believed it was just so full of science, so full of knowledge and experts that I could not hope to hold a light against it. If it wasn't for the grassroots organizations and the individuals that encouraged me, I don't believe I would have gathered the strength to join the field. And I think that's something important as well. I believe everybody on this call has that power to empower someone else, to believe in someone else. And that in itself starts this cycle of change. That one person that you empowered can become someone pursuing that path. I was able to become someone pursuing that path. I really only started in international business because I wanted to open a cafe. And now here I am working towards climate action. And I think that's the beauty of the field we're in. It's so intersectional. And honestly, everyone has a role in it. It's just a matter of just making that space for yourself, especially for, I guess, people like me. I've come from a very low income community, BIPOC as well. And I never really believed I could take space up in that conversation. But afterwards, I realized in order for sustainable movements and just, I guess, climate action to be instituted equitably, they have to be heard. People like me have to be heard. If not, we're just going to continue to be ignored. And we can't have that anymore, really. Especially here in Miami, we're one of the epicenters of climate change. And that's why I decided to stay here and be at FIU, honestly. I think it's the best way for me to learn and especially to empower others to fight for our home, especially because, again, summers are getting hotter, hurricanes are getting stronger, and I'm kind of frustrated of just focusing every year on how I can keep my house stable instead of just being able to thrive. I don't want to continue to struggle to survive anymore. So those are some of the talking points that I wanted to start off with, but I think another important thing is that education like this in terms of climate change shouldn't start at higher education. It should start way earlier. If it did start earlier, I feel like my journey within this would have been a lot easier and I would have felt a lot more empowered. I would have had more knowledge. But I kind of just got into college right after the pandemic, and it was just I had to figure it all out. And it led to a lot of burnout for sure. And I think that's something else that's important. It's the priority of mental health within students. We are youth. We are focusing on just creating that future for ourselves while also making sure that we have that future to begin with, especially with the threat of climate change just being doom and gloom on top of us. But yeah, those are, I guess, my main points. I think what you guys can all do is encourage that catalyst within students, that frustration and that story. That is the power that they all have. And from that, there's only endless realms of possibilities in which they can grow, right? Even within all of you, you have that story, you have that frustration, and that's why we're all here. So I think encouraging that next generation of youth and leaders, that's how it starts, making sure that their story does count no matter where they're coming from, especially in a world as vast as this, where we have students coming internationally with different issues altogether. We have food deserts, we have lack of water, lack of homes, we have so many issues, and I think all of them deserve to be heard in order to create that future that we can all equitably thrive. Right. Yeah, those are my points. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sarai. I know the task force, when I'm watching people shaking their heads, right? Shaking their heads around you moving from fear to empowerment, just fantastic. And we appreciate your confidence and you being such an agent for change. And encouraging us to really think about how do we empower equitable voices at the table to drive change. And so I think that's a fantastic transition to a woman who has done so much in terms of mobilizing and advocacy and impact. As the former minority leader in Georgia House of Representatives and now senior advisor for Rewiring America, we are standing in admiration for the phenomenal work of Stacey Abrams and just delighted to have you with us. So we'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter-Reid. Thank you, Dr. Wilkinson, and so much to the Aspen Institute and all for having me. I should have gone first, but because I didn't know I was going to have to follow Sarahi. So, please forgive me. But I want to tie together both the conversation with Anthony and Sarahi to what we can do. And I want to start with my story. I am a senior counsel to Rewiring America, which began as a think tank to engage communities and consumers directly in the IRA. How do we make certain that the resources that are coming through the IRA actually get directly to people? We know a lot of those dollars are flowing into our states through jobs, but the issue is how do we get communities where they live to understand the impact? And so rewiring was very much front and center, and getting that money put into the IRA, billions of dollars, about 8.8 billion in terms of direct rebates, as well as basically unlimited cap on tax credits. The problem is no one believes it, and no one knows how to use it. And if you believe it and want to use it, you don't know where to go to get it. And so my job, the job I was brought on board to help with, was to think about how do we connect people to this reality? Because as Anthony's research showed, people are on the spectrum of understanding, but what they don't get is what their role is. And we know that 42% of all energy-related emissions are made at decisions that are made around the kitchen table. So it's what you cook with, what you drive, how you clean your clothes, how you pay your utility bills. And so whether you are a college student or grad student in an apartment or a homeowner or someone living in public housing, the ability to impact climate action is real, but it is remarkably opaque. My responsibility and my engagement in this came about because I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico in Mississippi, low-income family near Cancer Alley, which is the area, of course, Dr. Hunter-Reid, in southwestern Louisiana, where petrochemical plants have basically created absurdly high levels of disease. I, in college, actually focused on environmental action, environmental issues, because I've always seen it as part and parcel of democracy. The ability to control where you live and how you live is vital to a vibrant democracy. And I think that's where colleges and universities and higher education has its strongest power. So my journey began because I lived near these communities, but your opportunity and our opportunity is how forward. And so I started with me, but now I want to talk about you. Higher education has such remarkable institutional power and privilege that often goes unused. It's not simply the ability to affect and build strong students, faculty, and staff. It's also the ability to impact and engage and invite community to understand. And because you carry that institutional authority, your ability to cut and to diminish the sense of isolation or being overwhelmed is stronger than any other institution than you can imagine. People like smart people. We don't like to say it, but we do. And when we think someone smart is telling us what to do, we are more likely to at least give them an ear. And so I think higher learning being engaged, not simply on the campus, but in their surrounding communities, is a transformative opportunity in this moment. Because most people see climate action not simply as something opaque, but as a question of sacrifice. Where higher learning can really stand in is to say that this is also an opportunity moment. It's how you can get better jobs. We know that 1.3 million new jobs will be created just around the issue of residential electricity. How do we electrify everything? Multiply that out by the number of jobs that can be created, place-based jobs that cannot be moved. Universities and organizations in those communities have the opportunity to change climate action from a sacrifice conversation to a conversation about opportunity. As Sarahi pointed out, a lot of students don't know that they can do it if they're not sitting in one of Dr. Zerowitz's classes. But this is something that cuts across every discipline. We can all have a conversation and be a part of it, but it's going to have to come from higher education to let people understand that there is a place for them and a space for their activity. And then there is the us piece. So there's me, there's you, and then there's us. Together, what we have the opportunity to do over the next decade is leverage the resources coming through and become translators. I grew up in the South. I still live in the South. And when I talk about climate action, I always say that I translate progressive policy into Southern. When people think they're going to lose their jobs, lose their livelihoods, or lose their future, they cannot hear us. But when we shift this from a national geographic conversation, I think Anthony put it well. When people think it's about polar bears, it's interesting, but it's not their job. When we make it an HGTV conversation, when it's about where you live and how you live, people are much more willing to hear it. And where universities can be extraordinarily helpful is that within your institutions, you have academic divisions that do not see themselves as part of this conversation, but they can be the best translators. Sarahi mentioned housing. The conversation about affordable housing is directly connected to whether or not we're building housing where we can reduce the cost of that housing by making it more sustainable. That's a policy conversation, but that's also a practical conversation. Making certain that it's not just Sarahi, but other students who are helping community members propose legislation at the local level. We know that things get complicated at the state level and certainly at the federal level, but there's a lot that can be done at the local level simply by changing small pieces of public policy and not waiting to be invited, but actually creating the space for engagement. And so as I close my remarks, I would say that our opportunity through higher education is to think about, where do I begin? What's my me conversation? Expand that to the you conversation. What does the institution have the ability to influence? And then how do we do it together to create change?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Phenomenal. Each of you just have been so informative and so helpful as we think about how to advance this work. I would like to start the conversation, but I want to remind the task force members to please put your questions in the chat because Catherine will be navigating, making sure that all those questions are asked, or as many of those are asked as possible. So I want to start with sort of Stacy has tried to sort of weave the conversation between all of our fantastic panelists today. And as I thought about the first conversation about seeing it as a distant problem, students seeing it as a scientific conversation, and then Stacy talking about it as a kitchen table conversation. I want to ask this question about most effective engagement, because as Anthony pointed out, there's a dismissive loud group, but they're not the majority. So how do we think about engagement that is effective and that is centered in where you live, as Stacy talked about, and what you care about? How do we think about the most effective engagement that would reach the masses, the most people? How should we be thinking about that?
I'll start. I think there's two pieces. One is to recognize, as Anthony's chart so ably pointed out, that we have different communities of need. Therefore, you have to have different conversations of response. But by making it localized, you connect the dots and you give them space to actually see themselves in the conversation. One thing that we're doing through rewiring, for example, to get people, there has been a very strong pushback against, for example, induction stoves, a culprit that no one expected to be the hot button issue, no pun intended. It's induction stoves versus gas stoves. If it's a conversation about sacrifice or you have to give this up, most people will not want to engage unless they're already, if they're on the end of the spectrum that says, I want this to be true, I'm alarmed, this is something I can grab onto, they're great. For those who are dismissive or discouraged, they're going to listen to anything that tells them they don't have to act. But for everyone in the middle, it's an opportunity. Do you want something that cooks your food faster, that's cleaner? So it's making it very granular, and it's taking even the biggest constructs and making it a little more easily understood. We know that if we electrify our homes, the average homeowner will say, or the average person paying rent, so let's not say a homeowner, the average person paying rent or paying a mortgage will save $3,000 a year in their utility bills. So electrification, which is climate action for the individual, saves you money. If we talk about it in terms of saving the polar bear, the alarmed person might do it and the person who's concerned will, but the cautious person is like, I don't know. But if you say you can save $3,000, that becomes a very real conversation, and it's a point of entry. And so the reason I frame it that way is that you begin by connecting the dot to the person, but then you use that, as Anthony said, as a lead to get them to the larger conversation. But they can't hear the larger conversation until they know what it means for who they are and where they live.
Great point. Great point.
Can I
Yes.
springboard off of that?
Yes.
So Stacy, of course, this nails it, that it takes different strokes for different folks. And so, I often call climate change the policy problem from hell, because you almost couldn't design a worse fit for our psychology or our institutions of decision-making. It's very difficult for political leaders who operate on 2, 4, or 6-year cycles to deal with a problem that unfolds over generations. But what climate change has going for it, that's very unique to climate change, is that it's all-encompassing. We're talking about the life support systems of the planet. So every single human being, every single more than human being on this planet has a direct and real stake in the outcome of this. And so climate change, it permeates everything we do, because it's about the burning of fossil fuels first and foremost, which is in our clothes, it's in our food, it's in the way we move around, it's responsible for our ability to talk to each other right now. It is the lifeblood of modern civilization. And yet it's a 19th century energy system that we need to switch to a 21st century energy system that is clean and renewable, and we can control, not petrostates and everything else. And so her point is just like so important, is to connect the dots to the things that people already care about, the people, the places, and the things that they already care about. To our students' example, you do not need to be a climate scientist to care about climate change. Please, no, we don't need that, okay? We do need you to care about it because of a whole host of other reasons. Maybe your kid has asthma. That's a good reason to care about climate change. Maybe you don't like poison ivy. You should care about climate change because it's making it worse. Maybe you care about chocolate. That is a perfectly good reason to care about climate change. Maybe you care about climate change because your faith and religion tell you that this is an existential threat that we must address for our responsibilities to other human beings, to the planet of which we're part, and to the divine, however you configure that. All of those and so many more reasons are perfectly legitimate and appropriate ways for people to connect this issue to what they already care about.
if I also may add to that point, amazing points from the both of you. I think for me, priority has always been of making the intangible tangible. So through me, I've always had to engage with youth. So I've always had to have difficult conversations in which they had to, I guess, realize that this is a now problem instead of a future problem, especially through canvassing. I have canvassed before for pro-equality candidates and etc. So I've had to, I guess, update my vocabulary and determining of like what I talk about. But it, as Stacy mentioned, and as Anthony mentioned as well, it just depends on what the regional and local issues are and how you can bring that to their attention. So making something so far away and such a big issue into something smaller that they can see in their everyday life that affects them. So again, like poison ivy, like chocolate, like asthma, those things are something that they can realize is affecting their current life and they would want to do something about it. So it's all the power of vocabulary and how you word things, but also the power of creating community. So the biggest thing that I've noticed that helped me on my college campus was creating that club, creating that chapter, and making climate change a less intimidating topic to join in on. Again, it was a group of students that all wanted to discuss it and do something in regard to advocating for it. That creation of community was what made the biggest difference in allowing people to want to join that space and empowering people to join that space and sharing resources in which they can grow more within on. So those are my points. Thank you.
Excellent points. Thank you so much. I appreciate the chocolate, the asthma, and as Stacy talked about, the pocketbook issues and trying to make it as localized as possible. I do think that's really important as we think about empowering people, but also moving them to change. So I want to turn it over to Catherine, who's going to keep the task force conversation going and remind you again to please put your questions in the chat so that we can get to as many of those as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you to our panelists for so many rich insights. I'm excited to get into questions, which we've got some flowing in from the task force, but because I spend a lot of my time also thinking about climate communication, I want to just have a quick follow-up on this one. Anthony, I was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit to the research that you all did with the Potential Energy Coalition. And as much as we think about the need for sort of a biodiversity of messaging that speaks to the day-to-day, one of the insights in that I found so potent is that sort of the closest thing we have to a universally resonant framing is around the importance of climate action to protect the planet for next generations. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that so that we don't get 100% lost in the million different flowers blooming ways of climate communication, and also think about some of those through lines that really are resonant. And then I'm going to tee up a bunch of task force folks to jump in.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Catherine. So that was a study that we just recently conducted in about 26 countries around the world. So that's the frame of this, and that was the single narrative approach, the single best reason framing for why people think we should be taking action on climate change, not jobs in the economy. I mean, people say that would be nice, but they're not convinced that, taking the clean energy transition is going to be a major source of employment for most people. What they're mostly motivated by is, frankly, and I want to cut straight to the emotional core of this, is love. Love for people, love for places, and love for things. But the Beatles weren't entirely right. Love is not all you need. You also need to understand that those things that you love are threatened by this problem called climate change. And that generates a sense of worry in people, and that motivates them to then get involved, to learn more about the issue, to figure out what the potential solutions are that they can do and that we can all collectively do, and then to actually implement and follow through on those over many, many years. It's what we all do in trying to keep ourselves healthy for our older age, or thinking about, your children's education over the long term. Like, you need to be motivated to keep it up for years and years and years. It's not fear. Fear is really good when you're about to be pounced on by a saber-toothed tiger. It is not a useful an emotion for a long-term problem like climate change. So it's just to say that we really do need to connect to that emotional core at the same time that we are trying to help people better understand the science and all the consequences of climate change. So I just want to make a real plug for understanding higher education and frankly, all education as not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And that we need to talk to the entire human being, not simply to the analytical part of their brains, because it's what we feel about it that makes it meaningful and that motivates us to do something different.
I want to say preach. I'm not sure if that feels appropriate in this listening session, but thank you, Anthony. Tati, would you like to come off and ask your question, particularly around this framing and in the South?
Yes, thank you so much to our three speakers. You are all terrific. I'm really taking a lot away from this. I was really struck by the translation of progressive into Southern, and that really resonated with me. So as you talk about the IRA, what aspects do you see gaining traction in those conversations, and why do you think they're gaining traction? I can imagine you're having widespread conversations in a variety of places. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. One, I begin again with the opportunity versus the sacrifice. When people hear that they've got to give something up, they shut down or they become anxious. And so by starting with the opportunities that are embedded in the IRA, people are more open, especially across the South, because we are unfortunately states that have very few labor laws. We see a lot of these climate related jobs coming to the South. That creates an opportunity to say, do you know that these jobs are coming because of the IRA? And so climate action is not just about you losing something, it's about the ability and the opportunity for new jobs to come. And I think that's appealing not only to the adults in the community, it's also appealing to students because these are new jobs. This is a new way to think about your future. The second is to talk about it as freedom of choice. You should have the right to choose what you need. And so if you choose to have better technology, if you choose to upgrade your appliances, that's why I use HGTV. When you're talking about residential electrification, you're basically saying, get rid of your old water heater that's going to conk out on you in a couple of years anyway. Right now, the government's willing to help you buy a new one. You can decide you don't want that open flame that's making your kids' asthma worse. You can have an induction stove and you don't have to clean between the grates. It's that you can have a car that is cleaner and you don't have to pay. You don't have to worry about when gas prices go up again. You're not beholden to it. And so it's taking those very specific things and translating them into the biggest fears in the South, which are that it's a loss of freedom, it's a loss of opportunity, or a loss of a job. And then the last piece, and I think this goes to Anthony's point about religion, it is a moral question. But right now it's a moral question. If you don't already do it, then you are immoral. As opposed to what can we do to protect, I mean, because most people in the South, if they are religious, they're Christian, what can we do to protect and cultivate and serve the earth? And that's where farmers have actually been incredibly powerful because they know that climate action is real because they worry about their crops. And so it's having the conversation about what does it mean to have disasters coming. So it's both your stewardship of the land, but it's also the impact that it's having on your ability to make a living. And so it's taking, again, all of these macro questions, making them micro, but it's also using the translation matrix of Southern language to make people feel that they can hear themselves in the conversation. And let me say, this cuts across racial demographics. This is not white versus black versus brown. This is everyone. Because part of the challenge of being Southern is that we have created this sense that it's your fault if you're not successful. It's someone else's success. It's someone else's responsibility if you are successful. So if you're successful, somebody else did it. And if you're failing, it's your fault. And so with that as a frame, being able to have a conversation across racial demographies that respect and reflect how they enter those worlds is very helpful. But it's just fundamentally, it's about respect. And I think Anthony said this as well, as did Sarahi. If you show that you respect where they begin, they're willing to listen to you get to the next place. And this is the last thing I'll say. Part of my success in my political work has been, I do not believe in ideological transformation. My parents are pastors. Their job is to fix your soul. I don't have that kind of time or that ability. And there's no way to know if I'm successful until we get to the pearly gates. I don't try to change ideology. I try to change behavior. Ideology is why you do it. Behavior is what you do. And so instead of us trying to convince everyone that they have to believe what we believe, we just need to shift them to do what we need them to do and let them believe whatever they want to make that so. The extent to which we spend our time, and I know I'm talking to folks in higher education where this may cut against everything you hold to be true, but ideological transformation is nearly impossible. But behavioral conversion is absolutely doable. You convince a lot of young people who come in that they actually want to go to class every day. So if you can do it with them, you can do it with us.
Thank you, Stacy. Charity, would you like to pop in with your question for Sarahi? And also, I should say, panelists, if there's something that gets, a question that goes to one person that you're keen to add on to, just, raise a hand or jump in. At most welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Catherine. Stacy, I really appreciate your words, and I completely agree. And I'm just honored to be just on the same Zoom call as our panelists that are here. But I'm also a student at Columbia and a scientist here. And Sarahi, your work is so amazing. It was really, I think your insight is so valuable, and you do really phenomenal work in the community in Miami. And I feel like there's the common trend that I've been hearing as a member of this task force, but hearing from our youth participants in past listening sessions, was listening about kind of like the effect of mental health while advocating, because I feel like there's like this really, I don't want to even call it a burden, but so many leaders turn towards our youth to kind of come up with these solutions to the climate crisis, even though we didn't create this world where we don't have access to the things that our grandparents once did. But I was just curious, like, what you probably get asked this question a lot, but what are ways policymakers, universities, and organizations can support youth such as yourself pursuing higher education, but also support community members that are at the forefront of the climate crisis?
Thank you so much for your question. For one of the points in your question, I think one of the things that universities and higher education can do for people at the forefront of the climate crisis is that a lot of them do a lot of community service, and a lot of them are very big presences in the community. So for Miami-Dade College, they are known as like a change-making institution. They help with food banks. They help the community a lot, especially during like hurricanes and other like natural disasters. I think, honestly, every institution can have that same effect, considering how big of a presence they are in cities and big cities, small ones as well. They have that power to be that reliable presence for a lot of communities. So that's a way that they can do so. They can do that through just creating that community, but also through programs that they can institute. So for example, there, as I mentioned before, there's clubs and there's organizations that students make in order to just have those safe spaces and have those conversations. I think that administration, as well as advisors, can do a better job, I guess, at interacting with those organizations and encouraging them to continue the work that they do. I feel like, at least for my campus, we started a new club that wasn't really there before. In this campus specifically, it was a very big Latin population. And unfortunately, in our culture, there's a lot of homophobia. And we started a pride club. So it was a very difficult uphill battle, I would say, but it was still able to happen. So I would say, like, if professors and administration could do a better job at creating that welcoming environment, it would make it a lot easier for members of the community, especially students that are struggling with so many other things outside of school, to be a part of these conversations and want to create these changes without being afraid that they're going to be fought back on it. In terms of policymakers, the board that I'm on, it's made of lawyers and architects and people with PhDs, I would say. So I was always really scared of joining it, but they all individually encouraged me to join it because the power of my story and the power of my advocacy experience was already more than enough. And I could offer my experience to fill in the gap that they had on that board. So policymakers, again, can encourage youth through like having them recognize, I guess, their individual strength, that your frustration, that catalyst, that story that you have is more than enough. And you can build on top of that. Again, I'm 20. I just started my organizing journey around 2 years ago. And that journey can happen for anybody at any time in their lives. And I think that for people that are already established within their journeys, like policymakers, universities, organizations, they have the very unique opportunity of seeing that journey start for someone else and empowering it and lessening, I guess, that burden that you mentioned earlier for them, so that they can only focus on, I guess, not being burnt out and fighting for what they want, but just honestly being able to thrive and advocate and be passionate and not be afraid of that passion. Yeah, that's what I had to say.
Right,
Right.
thank you. Yes,
Vice Chair
Anthony,
Barnett?
please.
So I want to come back to what can higher education institutions do? And I really want to underscore both what Sarahi and Stacy have said earlier of how important these institutions are in their own communities. So there's the obvious stuff, right? Universities and colleges do research, which can help address climate change. They teach students, which can help prepare them for the world they're going to inherit. They do lots of public engagement in their local communities, at the state level, at the regional level, at the national level, at the global level, all of which can be incredibly supportive to the world in solving climate change. And that's across the entire curriculum: natural sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, the business, the law schools, the medical schools. Okay, we're seeing actually enormous growth now in the health community, recognizing that they're already seeing the impacts of climate change showing up in the emergency room. So all of those parts of the university can connect to this issue and make their own contributions. I just want to quickly touch on 4 other things that maybe people aren't thinking about as much. One, the college is a living laboratory. It's a mini city in many ways. It has buildings, it has facilities, it has power systems. It is often a place where you can try out and pilot test whole systems that haven't been done before. I mean, I'll just plug my own institution has actually implemented a carbon tax within Yale University and found that it actually works really well. And so now we're being contacted by colleges and businesses around the world are saying, well, how did it work? How could we do that at our own small scale? Another big one. These are institutions that have enormous identity in their local communities. Just think sports. People love their local universities and identify with them. They go crazy for their universities on so many different levels. That is also a way to engage them in this issue, because it turns out sports are also connected to climate change. It's a moment where students are in between living in their parents' home and their first purchase of their own home, or their own going out and living and establishing their own lifestyle. So this is this critical moment in the life of any human being that goes through college, is to stop, reflect, learn, and figure out what kind of a lifestyle are you going to adopt going forward. Okay, so it's actually a hugely important critical turning point in any young person's life. And then the last thing I want to emphasize, and this is based on research that we've done, is, and I'm happy to report that as the parent of a college student, parents can in fact influence their kids, especially around energy use behavior. But if anything, the arrow of causality is stronger the other direction in getting adults to care about climate change. Young people have enormous power within their friend group, within their families, within their grandparents, and their larger social networks to engage this conversation and get people talking about it. And I just want to say that is one of the greatest superpowers that every single person has, is to talk about climate change.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And in our last couple of minutes, Stacy, I would love to come back to you for any of your thoughts, aspirations for the role of higher education, and perhaps also, given the world you know so well, how higher education can be a useful contributor to a political environment that is conducive to climate action. So we'll turn it to you to close out our panel.
So I would refer back to Anthony's map of intensity when he demonstrated how many families, how many adults want their young people to understand what this means. That's a cry for help. They want someone to know. And our Gen X, and boomers, we all know that young people they've become our sort of interstitial translators, not just of we need them to translate what they're saying, but they are also translators of a technology and of a world that they are more directly connected to in an immediacy than we can sometimes feel. Politically, that means we can leverage that engagement regardless of who leads the state. So I saw a question about having governors who aren't necessarily receptive. I'm familiar with that challenge. And what I will tell you is that we have multiple tiers of government, and we tend to focus on the one that we're most afraid of or that is least responsive. But that means we allowed opportunities to go to places where we can actually change things. Local government gets the shortest shrift and has the deepest impact on climate action. Because if we can get local governments to make different choices, it starts to impact more of our lives. And remember, every person who runs for governor or state legislature or Congress or president cares about the people who are in that local government because that's their competition. I mean, I say this having been one myself, and I do not intend any insult, but politicians respond to three things. They're like 14-year-old girls: money, peer pressure, and attention. I would say it's true for boys too, but I wasn't one. So I can only speak from my experience. The money that higher education has is not money that they need to spend on lobbyists, but it's spending those dollars on their students, on their staff, and on their administration, especially staff, because staff tends to be drawn from within those surrounding communities. So using your resources to educate and engage not simply your students and your administrative staff and your faculty, but that staff that is often completely ignored, but is the most reflective of the communities you're a part of. Number two, it's actually taking, as Anthony said, and as Sarahi is doing, taking your institutional power and turning that into policy. Most local government has no staffing. They don't have the money for it, especially rural communities. So if you can put forward legislative, not just this idea, but let me give you a bill, let me give you a resolution, let me tell you something you can do, make it as micro as you can so it feels achievable, but big enough that it feels aspirational. That is a political impact. It is not simply about who you vote for. It's what the people who got voted in do with the power you gave them. And that's where the peer pressure and attention come in. The peer pressure is that if you're giving that same information to multiple folks, people start to notice whether they are on your good side or your bad side, because they know you've got voters on your campus who can decide whether they keep their jobs or not. And that peer pressure changes into policy. And then the attention is lauding those who do well, chiding those who do not, but always celebrating and amplifying what is happening. Because the other power of a public of a higher institution of higher education is your ability to amplify every narrative and every story across entire communities. My older sister is the vice president of a college in Kentucky, and what she can do with one convening is the equivalent of what an entire city government can do, because she has the ability to pull people in, to engage them, give them information, and then send them back out. And as we head into yet another year where political decisions will be made, when institutions of higher education show up in the public space, when they see themselves not just as consumers, but as shapers of that conversation, the politics become very real. And the politics are we either act or we don't act. And if we're going to act, do we act in the right direction or do we go in the wrong direction? And I want you all to understand your political power is not one of partisanship, it is a peopleship. People don't care about your parties. They care about their lives. And your ability to help their lives for the better is the most incredible power that you can own. And I encourage you all to use it well. Thank you.
Stacey, thank you for landing us in such a powerful place with some really useful answers to that persistent drumbeat question of what can we do specifically in higher ed. We are at time for this portion of the program. I want to thank everyone so much for joining this 6th listening session of the Higher Ed Climate Action Task Force. This has been a really amazing opportunity for all of us and those who have joined these sessions to learn from people across the country, including Sarahi, Stacey, and Anthony. And we are now going to get to work writing a plan, an action plan, and we will ask that you look forward to its release next year. With enormous amounts of gratitude to our panelists, this session is now concluded. Thank you all so very much.